happening at the end of March and into April. And on the back side is a summary of the cuts, the priority of cuts that they're talking about making in the Beaverton School District, which I thought for those who are interested in such things and want to be part of a process. There's also a link on the front where you can actually submit budget comments online if you want to do that. And for any people who are, well, last week a question came up about who's watching the judges and paying attention to them and how do we find out information and so on. I mean, there are a variety, there's no place I know of that really pulls all that information together in one place. But there's a group called Judicial Watch that probably comes as close as anybody. They pay attention to a variety of issues, but I think they also do a number of, they sort of monitor court decisions and the judges who make those decisions. So I have something here. This last week I happened to get a survey on efforts to grant backdoor amnesty to illegal aliens. So if anybody is interested in that, I'll just let you have my copy of this. For those of you who pack smartphones and things like that, ADF has a new mobile app, which I actually loaded onto my iPod. So if you don't get their information otherwise, this is a way to kind of get it on the fly if you'd like to have that. So if you're interested in the info, you can come talk to me about it. And this last week, the ADF Truth and Triumph magazine had some really interesting articles, including one on a university professor who was hoisted over the side for suggesting that there may be a conversation to be had about the propriety of homosexual conduct. And you know, a concerned student who had heard about his comment in the class went to the university administration. He got fired, ultimately got reinstated with ADF's help. But so there's an interesting little interview with him about that, and some other stuff about libraries that don't allow church or religious groups to meet. It's okay if they're going to study about religious subjects, but they can't do anything that can be construed as worship. So if you can distinguish between worship and studying the Bible or things like that, then let me know how that works out for you. But that's the sort of thing that goes on in libraries actually all across the country. There's articles in here about efforts to protect marriage and so on like that. So if anybody would like to have this magazine, you're welcome to.
I have a copy too, but I was going to look up some of the websites, so I didn't bring it to share yet. I'll bring it next week.
Yeah, so
Which magazine is that again?
That's ADF's.
ADF, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't let the red star on the front throw you.
We've had that discussion before. Actually, if you look really hard, it's their logo. There's a red star on the A too in their logo, but nonetheless. And the latest issue of Imprimis has an article about the floating dollar. You know,
What's that?
huh?
You mean the sinking dollar?
They say the floating dollar. I'm just repeating what I've read. It's printed on the page. But anyway, it talks about some of the issues that we've dealt with is money really worth what we think it's worth, and being unhinged from a gold standard and everything like that. And one of the interesting things that was in there was a Supreme Court justice in one state, and I can't remember which one it was, who basically judicial salaries had stayed even for a long time. This judge says, well, if the dollar's floating and it's generally going down and we're not tied to a gold standard, that means for all intents and purposes I've gotten a pay cut. And that's not permissible. So, no, but the point being that constitutionally
That's not permissible.
that's not permissible. So what the justice is trying to do is to force a conversation about this whole bit about the dollar floating. So, John?
That's recent?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that book, All Work and No Pay, there's a book back in the 80s or something. There was an article in there about a bunch of judges did this quite a while ago too, way back in history.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying it's an original idea, but it's something that has come up recently, so. Anyway, Stephen, you had your hand up too? Okay.
I read a news item this week that Utah was accepting the gold standard now in transactions. Did you see anything on that?
Well, I don't know if that's been signed into law. I think they've, at least one house in Utah has passed the law.
Yeah, that's what I read, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Quite a few states are considering stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
People are starting to pay attention to those
They're
kinds
getting
of.
smarter,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh-huh.
So anyway, if you're interested in any of these materials, come see me. But lots of interesting things going on. So with that, now go easy on Doug today. He didn't bring his big book with the
Yeah.
Constitution, so he's working out of the same small
I
one.
have to read it. One of the things that's interesting about the Imprimis article is the guy who writes the article begins by talking about the panic right now that's going on because the standard for, I think it's the kilogram, right, which is a block of, I forget, platinum or some other metal with iridium in it, right? And they're worried about it because it's losing a few atoms. And they keep it in a place in France, is actually where they keep this standard of what a kilogram is. And it's kept, according to him, it's kept under 3 glass bells that, basically provide a vacuum around it. But they're noticing that this thing is losing mass. Well, that's what the kilogram is it's a measure of mass. And they're all panicked about what they're going to do about the fact that this thing is losing what is the equivalent of a few atoms. And he goes on then to articulate, well, why don't we let the kilogram float? Let's fix the dollar and make the kilogram float. So anyway, it's an interesting article. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, as we open up the Constitution today to look at it again, I pray that we would always be judging what we hear by the truth of the words that are written and by the standard of your word. That not one word of yours would fall to the ground. That unlike other standards, that we would keep this one and be faithful to it. So we just trust that your Spirit will guide us into the truth. Let those things which are not true fall to the ground, and we just ask for your blessing on this time this morning. In your name, amen. Okay, we're going to take a quick run through the last several articles of the Constitution, partially because some of it's arcane. There's not as much quote-unquote meat here, although we'll get into a couple of things that I think will provoke some discussion in these last few articles. So Article 4, Section 1 really talks about the full faith and credit, and what that really means is that states have the obligation to recognize one another's laws. And Herb brought this up, I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, in terms of a simple example is the fact that you can drive your car down to California, and if you get stopped for a speeding ticket, they won't also cite you for having an Oregon driver's license instead of a California driver's license. But originally it was focused on the enforcement of debt claims. They were worried that people would contract debts and move from one state to another, and therefore try to repudiate their debts. And so this was actually their primary goal in setting this in the first place. And the other thing was that they really did want to have a combination national and federal system. And by doing that, they wanted to minimize the opportunities for conflicts between the states. And this was a good way to do that. And